This is lesson 5.3, Solving Multi-Step Inequalities. Your objectives are to solve linear inequalities involving more than one operation and solve linear inequalities involving the distributive property. This is very similar to solving equations of this difficulty. Step 1, distribute and multiply by the LCD if you have any fractions that you don't want to deal with later. Step 2, combine like terms. Step 3, add or subtract. Get the variables on one side first and then move any constants to the other side. And then last, multiply or divide. And remember, if you multiply or divide by a negative, you got to flip that sign around. Less than would become greater than, and greater than would become less than. If you follow these steps, everything should work out just fine. Solve each inequality. Number 1. 11y plus 13 is greater than or equal to negative 1. Let's just go down the list and make sure that we get each step, get the variable by itself. There's nothing to distribute, and there's no fractions that I would need to worry about. I can't combine any like terms. Next is add or subtract. Since the variables are all on one side, let's move the constants. There's a 13 added to the variable. Do the opposite and subtract 13. You get negative 14 on the right. And finally, multiply or divide. That's a y times 11. Do the opposite and divide both sides by 11. That won't divide evenly, so just leave it as the fraction negative 14 elevenths. All y such that y is greater than or equal to negative 14 elevenths. If you're ever in doubt of what to do, just go down your list. Distribute and worry about the fractions. Combine like terms, add or subtract, and multiply or divide. Number 4, 6n plus 12 is less than 8 plus 8n. Let's go down the list. There's nothing to distribute. There's no fractions that I should multiply by the LCD. I can't combine any like terms. Now add or subtract. There's variables on both sides, so let's move those first. Move the smaller one. The 6n is smaller than the 8n, so move the 6n. It's positive 6n there, so let's do the opposite and subtract it from each side. It cancels out on the left, leaving a 12. And then 8n plus 6n is 2n. Still adding and subtracting. We have an 8 over there with the variable. The 8 is a positive. Do the opposite and subtract it. 12 minus 8 is 4. 8 cancels on the right, leaving 2n. That's a 2 times n. Do the opposite and divide both sides by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and the 2's cancel on the right. Finally, make sure your variable ends up on the left side. The mouth is open to the n. The mouth is still open to the n. N is greater than 2. So all n is such that n is greater than 2. Number 7. Negative 3x plus 6 all over 2 is less than or equal to 12. Go down the list. There's nothing to distribute, but I do have a great big fraction there that I would like to simplify. So let's multiply both sides by the LCD. With just one fraction, the LCD is 2. So we'll multiply both sides by 2. On the left, something divided by 2 times 2 cancels out the 2. So we're left with negative 3x plus 6. On the right, we have 24. There's no like terms to combine. Now add or subtract. The variables are all together, so move the constants. There's a 6 over there added to the x's. Do the opposite and subtract 6 from each side. The 6's cancel on the left, leaving a negative 3x. And 24 minus 6 is 18. Now multiply or divide. We have a x times negative 3. Do the opposite and divide both sides by negative 3. The negative 3's cancel on the left, leaving x. And since we divided by a negative, we have to flip that sign around. Less than or equal to becomes greater than or equal to. 18 divided by negative 3 is negative 6. So all x such that x is greater than or equal to negative 6. Just go down your list of steps. And remember there at the end, if you multiply or divide by a negative, flip that sign around. Number 10. Negative 4y minus 10 is greater than 19 minus 2y. There's nothing to distribute, and there's no fractions to worry about. I can't combine any like terms. Now add or subtract. Let's move the variables first, since I have variables on both sides. And I know normally I say to move the smaller amount of variables, but this time we'll move the greater amount. Ultimately, it really doesn't matter. You have the freedom to choose. Most of the time it's easiest to move the smaller amount, but you could do it either way. We have a negative 4y and a negative 2y. I'm going to move the negative 2y. Do the opposite and add it to both sides. Could you move the negative 4y instead? Yes, but we're going to do it this way. Negative 4y plus 2y is negative 2y minus 10. On the right, the 2y's cancel, leaving 19. Still adding and subtracting, we have a 10 there that's subtracted. Do the opposite and add it to both sides. The 10's cancel on the left, and 19 plus 10 is 29. Now multiply or divide. We'll divide both sides by negative 2. The negative 2's cancel on the left, and since we divided by a negative, we have to flip that sign around. Greater than becomes less than. And 29 divided by negative 2 is negative 29 halves. Put the negative out in front of the fraction. Don't leave it in the denominator. A positive divided by a negative is a negative. So all y is such that y is less than negative 29 halves. Remember there at the end, since we divided by a negative, we had to flip that sign around. Define a variable, write an inequality, and solve each problem. Number 13. Negative 3 times a number plus 4 is no more than the number minus 8. Well, our variable will be the number. Pick any variable you like. We will use n. Negative 3 times a number, so negative 3n, plus 4 is no more than. When it says is no more than, it can't be greater, but it can be less than or equal to. Remember, is no more than is less than or equal to. The number, that's n, minus 8. Now solve. There's nothing to distribute, no fractions to worry about. I can't combine any like terms. Now add or subtract. Since there's variables on both sides, let's move the variables first. Let's move the variables to the left. So I'll move the n to the left-hand side. It's a positive n, so we'll subtract it from both sides. Negative 3n minus n is negative 4n. Always remember, n is 1n. So negative 3n minus 1n is negative 4n. The n's cancel on the right, leaving a negative 8. Watch that sign in front of the 8 there, it's negative. Still adding and subtracting, I have a 4 over there added to the n's. Do the opposite and subtract those. They cancel on the left. Negative 8 minus 4 is negative 12. And now divide both sides by negative 4. Since we divided by a negative, we're going to flip that sign around. And negative 12 divided by negative 4 is 3. All n's such that n is greater than or equal to 3. On that one, we could have added 3n to both sides on that first step. But take your pick. Most of the time it's easier to move the smaller one, but you can solve them either way. Now we're going to do some more multi-step inequalities that will involve the distributive property. These are going to get more complicated. Just make sure you follow step by step. Go straight down the list of steps and everything should be just fine. Solve each inequality. Number 1. 2 times the quantity t plus 3 is greater than or equal to 16. We can distribute first. Remember, when you distribute, you do the outside times every piece inside. 2 times t is 2t. 2 times 3 is 6. Greater than or equal to 16. Now go down the rest of the list. There's no fractions to worry about. I can't combine any like terms. Now add or subtract. The variables are together. I do have a constant over there with the variable. The 6 is added. To move it, we will subtract it from each side. They cancel on the left, and 16 minus 6 is 10. Finally, multiply or divide. That's a t times 2, so do the opposite and divide by the 2. You get t is greater than or equal to 5. All t such that t is greater than or equal to 5. Just remember with these, if you can distribute, do that first. Number 4. 6y plus 10 is greater than 8 minus the quantity y plus 14. First step is distribute, and we can distribute on the right, so the left doesn't change yet. Now when we distribute here, watch that minus sign, because you have to distribute the minus sign. It's like it's saying negative 1 times everything in the parentheses. So negative 1 times y is negative y. Negative 1 times 14 is negative 14. There's no fractions to worry about. We do have like terms to combine on the right. 8 minus 14. So 8 minus 14 is negative 6. Now add or subtract. Get the y's on one side. We can move the one on the right. It's a y being subtracted, so do the opposite and add y to both sides. 6y plus y is 7y. And on the right, the y's cancel. Now move the constant. The 10 is being added. Do the opposite and subtract it. Negative 6 minus 10 is negative 16. And finally, divide both sides by that 7. So y is greater than negative 16 sevenths. All y is such that y is greater than negative 16 sevenths. Just make sure you're careful when you distribute with a minus sign like that. It's really -1 times the parentheses. So make sure you apply that to each item in the parentheses. Number 7. 3 times the quantity 2y minus 4 the quantity, minus 2 times the quantity y plus 1 the quantity, is greater than 10. First distribute, and we have 2 pieces to distribute here. First with the 3. 3 times 2y is 6y. 3 times -4 is -12. For the next one, watch that minus sign on the 2. -2 times y is -2y, and -2 times 1 is -2. There's no fractions to worry about. Now combine like terms. On the left, you can combine 6y minus 2y to get 4y, and we can combine -12 minus 2 to get -14. Add or subtract now. The y's are all on one side. Let's move the constants. The 14 is being subtracted, so do the opposite and add 14 to each side. That gives you 24 on the right. Finally, divide both sides by 4, and y is greater than 6. All y such that y is greater than 6. Always pay attention to your minus signs when you distribute. The -2 times the y and the -2 times the 1. Number 10. 0.3 times the quantity y minus 2 is greater than 0.4 times the quantity 1 plus y. Distribute first. On the left, 0.3 times y is 0.3y. 0.3 times -2 is -0.6. And on the right, 0.4 times 1 is 0.4. 0.4 times y is 0.4y. There's no fractions to worry about, and no like terms to combine. Next is add or subtract. Move the variables first to get them on one side. Normally we move the smaller one, but let's go ahead and just move the variables to the left. We'll move the 0.4y over to the left. Right now it's being added, so we'll do the opposite and subtract it from each side. .3y minus 0.4y is -0.1y. And the 0.4y's cancel on the right. Now move the constant over. The 0.6 is being subtracted, so do the opposite and add it to each side. It cancels out on the left. And 0.4 plus 0.6 is 1. Finally, divide both sides by -0.1. And since we divided by a negative, we're going to flip that sign around. Greater than becomes less than. And 1 divided by -0.1 is -10. So, all y such that y is less than -10. Define a variable, write an inequality, and solve each problem. Number 17. 3 times the sum of a number and 6 is greater than 4 times the number decreased by 2. Well, the variable will be a number, and you could make any variable you want. We will use the letter n. So, 3 times the sum, so I'll be adding some things together. What am I adding together? A number and 6. So n and 6. 3 times that sum. So the n plus 6 goes in parentheses there. Is greater than 4 times the number decreased by is minus 2. So when it says 3 times the sum, that sum goes in parentheses because you're going to add those together and then multiply. That's why we need the parentheses there. So now solve. Distribute first. 3 times n is 3n. 3 times 6 is 18. There's no fractions to worry about. No like terms to combine. Let's move the variables. Sometimes we move the smaller variable to the other side. This time we'll just move the variables to the left. The 4n is a positive 4n, so let's subtract it from each side. 3n minus 4n is negative n. And you're left with negative 2 on the right because the 4n's cancel. Now subtract the 18 from each side. You get negative 20. And that's a negative n, which is really negative 1 times n. So to get n by itself, do the opposite and divide both sides by negative 1. Since we divided by a negative, we flip that sign around. We have less than 20. All n such that n is less than 20. Remember, when you have a negative n, you have to multiply or divide both sides by negative 1 to get rid of that minus sign. When you solve multi-step inequalities, distribute first. Then if there's a lot of fractions or any big fractions, multiply both sides by the LCD. Combine like terms. Add or subtract, moving the variables first and then the constants. And finally multiply or divide. Remember, if you multiply or divide by a negative, you need to flip that sign around. Turn less than to greater than or greater than to less than.